Today, I am going to be discussing one of the greatest what-if scenarios in NBA history. And it's a scenario that will be surrounding three players that would have eventually made it to the NBA Hall of Fame. And it would have saw three of these players teaming up with each other, and possibly there would have been a fourth involved due to a butterfly effect if this one individual would have joined. And what I'm talking about is how Michael Jordan almost joined the Dallas Mavericks, and how his decision is one that he would come to regret. What's going on, everybody? Your boy TheFlightMike back again with some more NBA content. I'm not going to take up much of your time with this intro, guys. All I'm going to ask for is if you love the NBA and you want consistent, high-quality NBA content sent straight to your device, take a moment to drop a like, subscribe, and turn on my notifications. Furthermore, I really suggest you start following me on Twitch. We stream Tuesday nights, Thursday nights, and Saturday nights, and there's going to be a bonus Friday night stream today. And we've been getting kind of lucky with interacting with some very well-known athletes, such as De'Aaron Fox, and more recently we got followed by Ezekiel Elliott. Now that that's out of the way, let's take you back to the year 2000. It's January 4th, 2000, and the cellar-dweller Dallas Mavericks were finally sold to a billionaire entrepreneur known as Mark Cuban. Now, to set the stage for this entire story, you have to understand that for the past 20 years, the Dallas Mavericks were so atrocious that they've only won 40% of their games ever since they became an expansion franchise. Some expansion franchises happen to hit the ground running and experience immediate success, such as the Las Vegas Knights in the NHL, or even the Orlando Magic when they were incepted in the NBA. It's kind of a scary look when the Orlando Magic were created. It's not really a good look when the Orlando Magic came to the NBA in the 1989 to 1990 season and were able to make it to the NBA Finals merely 5 years later, whereas meanwhile, your team, the Dallas Mavericks, did hit the ground running in the 1980s. They were able to make it to 5 playoff appearances in the 80s alone, but ever since the turn of the decade in the 1990s, they were only able to make it to the NBA playoffs only once for the entire decade prior to Mark Cuban owning them. So going into the 1999 to 2000 season, the Dallas Mavericks have not seen the playoffs for about 9 years. The owner of the Mavericks was clearly losing way too much revenue on the team, so Mark Cuban purchases the team. The Mavericks undergo a tremendous rebrand, going from this logo to this pretty cool logo. And fortunately, the Mavericks had a pretty freaking good team when Mark Cuban acquired them. They had the tall, lanky, but promising Sean Bradley at the center position. They had some decent role players in Damon Jones, Hubert Davis, and Greg Buckner, not to mention Cedric Ceballos. But most importantly, they clearly had their future set up. They had Dirk Nowitzki, Steve Nash, and Michael Finley, and each of those players occupied their roles very well. You see, Steve Nash was in charge of facilitating the offense, whereas Dirk Nowitzki was able to dominate not only in the post, but stretch the floor, which was unprecedented in early 2000s basketball. Then they had Michael Finley, who was adept at slashing to the basket and could hit the open three. Could we give an honorable mention to Michael Finley? I feel like people really don't appreciate his career. I think he's one of the most underrated scorers from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, and to prove it to you, check out some of his highlights. After Mark Cuban's first year owning the Dallas Mavericks, the Mavericks improved significantly from a cellar-dwelling team to a team that was able to make it to the Western Conference semifinals, defeating the 4th-seeded Utah Jazz in the first round in the 2001 NBA playoffs, only to lose to the San Antonio Spurs in the Western Conference semifinals. That Mavericks team was absolutely deep, featuring the big three of Steve Nash, Dirk Nowitzki, and Michael Finley with a significantly more improved bench. They also added Juwan Howard, and they had some key contributors like Vernon Maxwell and a sweet shooting Spaniard named Eduardo Nájera. Mark Cuban understood that this Mavericks team was clearly one piece away from competing for the NBA championship perennially, and that's a player with leadership experience, championship experience, and possibly one of the greatest players of all time. A player that could easily take the young pieces of the Dallas Mavericks and teach them what it takes to win an NBA championship. That player was a player that was rumored to be making his way back to the NBA, a 38-year-old Michael Jordan. After being away from basketball for a couple of years, Michael Jordan clearly had the competitive itch return once again. That same competitive itch caused him to return to the NBA, although seeking a different role. In that time, Michael Jordan was trying his best to become the owner of any NBA franchise. So the owner of the Washington Wizards, Abe Pollin, offered Michael Jordan a phenomenal deal, an opportunity to be the Washington Wizards president of basketball operations, which also featured a 20% share of the Washington Wizards going to Michael Jordan. That would be the largest stake allocated to any black owner in the NBA at that time, surpassing Magic Johnson. During the time where the Washington Wizards were courting Michael Jordan, Mark Cuban actually reached out to MJ to join the Dallas Mavericks instead of the Washington Wizards. So here's how the story goes. Mark Cuban mentioned that after he purchased the Dallas Mavericks, he would go on to meet Michael Jordan, and he actually happened to see the paperwork that the Washington Wizards gave Michael Jordan for Jordan to join the Wizards. Mark Cuban saw the paperwork, which I don't really understand how a player like Michael Jordan would just be carrying, such personal paperwork and such private paperwork around with him, especially in front of another NBA team owner. But Mark Cuban would see the paperwork and say, dude, don't sign it. I'll do whatever it takes, and I'll give you partnership if you join the Mavericks instead. We'll win. And according to Mark Cuban, he said Michael Jordan couldn't change his mind because he had already committed to the Wizards, but Cuban would still try to get him to join the Mavs. Now, of course, you need to bear something in mind, and this is probably the only hole in the story, so you can let me know if you think Mark Cuban is telling the truth or not. But Mark Cuban purchased the Dallas Mavericks in January of 2000. The Washington Wizards also hired Michael Jordan as president and sold him part ownership in January of 2000. So if this was to happen, it had to have happened very, very soon, and within days of Mark Cuban having assumed ownership. But assuming the story is true, let me tell you what we're dealing with here. Because from the years of 2001 to 2003, when Michael Jordan played, he was still a decent player in the latter part of his career. As a matter of fact, he was a phenomenal player. He wasn't good enough to take a young Washington Wizards all the way to the NBA playoffs in his age 38 and 39 season, but I think he would have been good enough to take a team that features Dirk Nowitzki and Steve Nash and Michael Finley, and already a team that was set in place to compete in the future, and not only catalyze their development, but also help them win additional championships. Bear in mind, in the first year of Michael Jordan's comeback, the Dallas Mavericks would once again make it to the second round of the NBA playoffs, only to lose to the Sacramento Kings in the second round. And in Michael Jordan's last official season with the Washington Wizards, the Dallas Mavericks would lose in the conference finals against the San Antonio Spurs 4-2. With all due respect, I'm sorry, but I feel like a team of Dirk Nowitzki, Steve Nash, and Michael Jordan, and featuring a Michael Finley coming off of the bench, with a phenomenal ownership and a pretty good run and gun coaching staff, I can't help but feel like that team could have at least won 1 to 2 championships in the twilight of Michael Jordan's career. What's even more heartbreaking about this story is that Michael Jordan's integrity to the Washington Wizards would go unrewarded, as we all know how the story would end. Michael Jordan would retire from the Washington Wizards at the end of the 2003 NBA season. The Wizards would decide to move on from him as team president because he wasn't really a good president, and then he would go and assume ownership of the Charlotte Bobcats and eventually make them the Charlotte Hornets many years later. So I guess we could all unanimously agree that if this was the case, this was a time that Michael Jordan should have turned down the Washington Wizards and joined the Dallas Mavericks, as he could have potentially ended with 7 to 8 NBA championships and completely alter the course of NBA history. The Los Angeles Lakers could have potentially not three-peated, and the San Antonio Spurs could have potentially had one less NBA championship. Another parallel that I would like to draw that could potentially be irrelevant is the fact that Dennis Rodman was a member of the Dallas Mavericks during the 1999 to 2000 NBA season. This was following the three-peat he had with the Chicago Bulls and a failed tenure with the Los Angeles Lakers. So do you think Michael Jordan joining the Dallas Mavericks, although it may have been months later or maybe a year later, do you think that could have potentially impacted Dennis Rodman's career in such a way? Maybe he would have joined the Dallas Mavericks as a role player and they could have potentially won another ring together, or maybe I'm stretching things out. But on paper, a team composed of Dirk Nowitzki, Michael Finley, Steve Nash, Michael Jordan, and Dennis Rodman off of the bench just sounds absolutely amazing. But at the same time, Rodman would have been 39 years old during this time, so who knows how effective he would have been. Let me know what you guys think about this scenario in the comment section down below. Does it make sense? Do you even think it happened? Or do you think Mark Cuban's just trying to stir some controversy now that The Last Dance is on air? I'd like to hear what you have to say. I'm your boy, TheFlightMike, and I'll catch you guys in our next upload.